Let's just see if Lisa is there. Yay, Lisa is here. Excellent. Thank you very much. And could you please welcome to the stage someone who's been waiting very patiently backstage, Jessica Studdert, Deputy Chief Executive of New Local, who will be having a conversation with Lisa. Jessica.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you so much for your patience. I know a lot of you are still here and been waiting for this session. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us. I know that you've had a busy day with an opposition debate, but by the power of Zoom, here you are. Now, I can say that we've had a brilliant day. We've had up to 1,800 people join us, both online. I think we've still got some people online. We've got a massive audience, still kind of standing room only at the back, full of people who are all driven by a mission on community power, people who work day in, day out in their communities, people from across the public sector. Really keen to hear what you're going to say. I know you prepared a speech, so if you're still okay to do a speech, and then we'll go into some Q&A at the end. And guys, if you are able to look on Slido and ask your questions, do line them up for Lisa. So I'll hand over to you.
Oh, that is amazing. Thank you so much. And I'm so sorry that I'm not with you in person. I think if you wanted any better sign of what a mess our national political system is and why we need to disperse power far and wide in this country, it's that it hasn't even been possible for me to organise the parliamentary day sufficiently to be able to get out of this building. And I am genuinely sorry to miss it, because it's people up and down this country, ordinary people doing extraordinary things every day, day in, day out in their communities, that not only motivated me to get involved in politics in the first place, but is what gets me out of bed every day and drives me still. The theme of today's conference, community power, couldn't be more important, but it raises some incredibly fundamental questions. How do we put people back in the driving seat of their own lives, their communities, their country, to ensure that people and places have not just the resilience to weather the storm, but the ability to shape and drive their own communities, their country, to take charge of their own destiny? The reality for too many people in this country right now is the opposite. And for a long time in parts of Britain, including my home in Wigan, where good jobs have been replaced with low-paid, insecure work, and young people have been forced to get out to get on, that has become a crisis. They take with them the spending power that sustains the high streets, the post offices, the community pubs, buses and banks, and left behind this pervasive sense that we've lost control of our lives and our communities. But it's more than that. It's that we've written off the talent and the potential of most people and most communities. 50 years ago, the great trade unionist Jimmy Reed, in a speech called Alienation, said, "I am convinced that most people go through life without even a glimmer of what they could have contributed. That is not just a national tragedy, that is a social crime." Well, he was right. It's a disaster not just for individuals and communities, but it is at the heart of this country's current malaise. And this is exactly what Levelling Up was supposed to respond to. Not a Hunger Games style grant system that allows a lucky few a part refund on the money that's been taken from them to give a lick of paint to a failing high street. Not a limited transfer of powers from one group of men in Whitehall to another group of men in the town hall, but a recognition in the end that the country can't go on like this. Even the winners are losing. You can't power a major economy using only a handful of people in a handful of sectors in a few corners of the country. And you can't build a cohesive country when so many people can neither contribute to nor share in its success. It's why we're calling our first flagship piece of legislation the Take Back Control Act, with new powers to take ownership of land and assets through reform of compulsory purchase laws, rights for communities to be involved early in designing and developing the places we call home, not just limited rights through an archaic planning system to object after the event. Decisions that matter to us put back into our hands. And the centrepiece of that act will be to flip the presumption of power from Whitehall to the people, so that decisions over housing and transport and skills will be made far closer to home. Instead of asking Westminster for powers, we will presume that powers should be restored to those who rightfully own them, and set out a path to do so if there are reasons why not. But we know too from the example of the big society, which gave us rights on paper while taking from us the means to realise them, that without economic power, communities will always remain reliant on a dysfunctional market or a dysfunctional Westminster system. In most parts of the country now, we don't have the ability to insulate ourselves against shocks, whether it's the decisions of this government or the inflation crisis, which is currently hitting northern towns the hardest. And we're denied the ability to make decisions about the things that we care about most. What use, for example, is the right to take over assets of community value, like my football club, Wigan Athletic, which went into administration a few years ago and was offered back to the fans to buy? What use is that right to people who don't have £16 million that was required to buy it? That is why these rights have been exercised almost solely in those places where individuals and communities already hold assets and wealth. And we've seen the same trend across the board. We've seen it in the arts as cuts to councils and public subsidy has reduced. The arts has thrived where private donors are plentiful, while much loved institutions like the Oldham Coliseum go dark. And this matters deeply to a lot of people around the country. The arts are ways that people find to express themselves. Our arts and culture is a story that a nation tells to itself, about itself. And when so many people put out of that story, they're not just written off, they're written out of our national story altogether. When they were stripping public services back to the bone, when they were closing Sure Starts, when they were closing community centres, we were told it was all to cut the public debt. But what happened was that risk was pushed instead, that debt, onto individuals. So it was a double whammy, because we were stripped of resilience in our own lives and stripped of resilience in the community. The institutions, the networks and the safety nets that used to exist in so many parts of the country now long gone. So that so much of what we rely on, the care homes that look after us when we grow old, the fresh water that we need to survive, the power we need to heat our homes, have been transformed from social assets into sites for extraction and the upward redistribution of income from ordinary households to wealthy investors. It is, as Matthew Lawrence writes, that unless we contend with this, with the fact that from water to energy, from housing to telecoms, our essential utilities and infrastructures are not organised for the public good, but for private profit, we can never fully address the systemic root of our overlapping crises. This is the theft of what is our civic inheritance, and it's felt deeply by many people. It's taken from us not just the income, the assets and the institutions that rightly belong to us all, but the collective power that they enable. All of the upheavals of recent decades, whether it's rising populism or the vote to leave the European Union, the political upheaval of the 2019 general election, which turned the electoral map on its head, and the growing nationalism in every part of the United Kingdom. All of these owe their success to this shift in the balance of power from the many to the few. And to address this, the systemic powerlessness that now affects people and communities across Britain, we know that we have to do more than grant rights. We have to put real power, economic power, and the assets from which they're increasingly derived back into individual and community hands. Because this divide between those who have assets and those who don't is now the biggest and most consequential divide in Britain. In 2020, the least wealthy 10% of households had wealth of £15,400 or less. And in this group, at least half only held wealth in physical assets, and almost half held more financial debt than they did financial assets. A Resolution Foundation report highlights the fact that wealth has boomed while incomes have stagnated or fallen. So the gap in wealth between the top 10% and the bottom 40% is now 107 times average incomes, a divide second only to the United States in the world. And we saw during the pandemic and the financial crash that the consequences for those without assets can be appalling. When you have assets, you have power, and more of us don't, and so are powerless as a result. That's why I was genuinely baffled by the argument made recently by some on the left of politics that Labour shouldn't focus on how to extend the dream of home ownership to those who are currently shut out. At a time when home ownership is at its lowest level for a generation, and by the argument that says that social housing and home ownership are a zero-sum game, that you can do one or you can do the other, but you can't do both. It's little known that the right to buy, which has become a totemic issue for people on both the left and right of British politics, was originally a Labour policy. First dreamed up by Gaitskell, it was taken up by the Thatcher government, who, by refusing to replace the council housing stock that was sold, ended up disastrously pitting the rights of the individual against the rights of the community. But if you want people to have resilience, real resilience in their lives, you don't choose one or the other, you need both. Access to the assets that sustain you and your family and help you weather hard times, like your own home or the savings funds set up by the last Labour government to give young people, whatever their background, a fund to use at the age of 18. And you need common assets as well, like council housing, which provides a secure home for life, handed back to be used for future generations, or the credit unions and the building societies that sustained and supported us over a century. That's why our policy of defending the right to buy, where those homes can be replaced, like for like, isn't a compromise. It's essential to building a country where we tilt power back to people who have a stake in the outcome and skin in the game so they can build things that benefit most of us and things that last. And that distortion of that policy by the Thatcher government is a perfect example of how a strategy to extend access to assets for the many has become a way of extracting and taking rent-seeking by a few for a few. 40% of those homes that have been sold under right to buy are owned by buy-to-let private landlords, often rented back by councils desperate to help the million people on the social housing waiting list at extortionate cost to the general public through housing benefit. As Maurice Glassman says, capital has a tendency to centralise, and the only antidote to that is democracy. That's why we're determined to ensure that community assets can return to the community once more. Those institutions that, as the Conservative MP Jessie Norman once said, help to shape and define us as we help to shape and define them. And that's why we set up the Community Wealth Commission, chaired by Mark Gregory, the former chief economist at Ernst & Young, which will report this summer on community ownership. We believe communities shouldn't just have rights on paper to take on their football clubs, their historic buildings, the mills, the steelworks, the factories, the land and the live music venues that are part of our social fabric and civic inheritance, but they should have the means to do that, building on the community ownership fund that helps them to create ongoing revenue, a community fund of wealth to be used for the common good. With a powerful new community right to buy, first refusal on assets of community value and long-term vacant high street property too, and the right to buy them without competition. They'll have longer to raise the money, 12 months rather than 6. And we're following in the footsteps of the last Labour government in Scotland, which ensured that land could be taken back into community hands to be used for the good of all the people, not just some. Mark is looking at the brilliant organisations who've done this, like a group called Back on the Map in Hendon in Sunderland, which, watching their own community be going to rack and ruin at the hands of a few private landlords, decided to reclaim not just their community, but their power as well. They've bought up vacant housing stock. They've turned it into family and community homes, rented out at affordable rates to local people. And they've used the proceeds to reinvest in the community as well. Genuinely life-changing, game-changing stuff. And looking at the land reforms in Scotland that enabled a revolution in common ownership and emerging plans in Grimsby to build an endowment fund for the people of Grimsby for generations and generations to come, so that we can rebuild and restore the intermediary institutions that Keynes believed had a critical role, that belong neither to the state nor to the market, but belong to us all and help to democratise the economic realm. These are the institutions that have been lost over the last 13 years. They've been sold off, they've been flogged off, or they've been allowed to collapse. Like Northern Rock, an institution built by the people of the North East for the people of the North East, that partnered the people of the region through tough times and good for 150 years, weathering 4 major recessions and emerging stronger from each. It enabled the people of the North East to own their own homes. It supported a thriving civil society, and it stood with them, suspending mortgage repayments during the miners' strike. But a decision to demutualise it left it highly exposed, and in the financial crash that followed, it was finally sold off by the Cameron government. Or the Olympic legacy, the basis for our bid that won us the Games in London in 2012, was that a generation would have access to sport, not just the privileged few, but the generations that came after, regardless of their background or family income. But out of that Games, which boosted the UK economy by £13 billion, the school sports partnerships were abolished, the funds taken back to the Treasury, and participation in sport fell off a cliff. That's what accounts for the serious concerns about what's currently happening on Teesside, where the steelworks through which people on Teesside contributed so much to the whole of the UK for decades and decades has been transferred into private hands with no public conversation. These institutions are our civic inheritance. They're the institutions that will bolster us through the storms ahead, that will enable us to command economic power in our communities that is essential to taking back control of our own lives, our communities and our country. That is what underpins a real commitment to community power. And while for too long we've backed the rent seekers, this is how we'll build a country that belongs again to the creators, the builders, the makers and the doers. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lisa. I hope you can hear that applause coming through very strongly. A brilliant speech and really interesting to kind of link the democratic and economic aspects of community power through asset ownership in your speech. I'm going to ask you a few questions if that's okay. There's some great ones coming through on the Slido, so please do add to them and upvote them. It's hashtag ST23 and on the main stage in the Slido app. Lisa, just to kick off, can I just ask what this agenda means to you personally? What has kind of inspired you through your career so far that leads you to kind of believe so passionately in this agenda?
Well, I started out life working for the youth homelessness charity Centrepoint, and it was while I was working with those brilliant young people who'd been through hell and back in so many cases, who had as much ambition for themselves, for their lives, for their families, for their communities, as any other young person that I'd ever met. But so often were held back by not just the systems that we'd created that rubbed up against them when they tried to create change in their own lives, but actually because the circumstances of their lives had often been set before they were even born. The lives and circumstances of your parents are the biggest predictor of the lives and the circumstances that you'll inherit and that you'll lead. And that's about power, really. It's about who Britain is for. It's about the systems that we've created that should be there to support people in making real change in their own lives, that so often people rub up against when they try to make real change, instead of feeling the whole system pulling in behind them. It's what led me into politics in the first place. It's what made me believe that change was not just possible, but inevitable, because people won't put up with this for much longer, this situation where the talent, the contribution, the assets that exist in plentiful supply in every community in this country are being written off and squandered and written out of the national story. And I think I started to understand, working with those incredible young people, that governments don't change things, people do. But what you need is an active government prepared to walk alongside people as they seek to create that change in their lives. And that's really what drives me and motivates me, and also lies behind the work that we're doing with Mark and some of these incredible commissioners that we've got on the Community Wealth Commission, including some amazing people from Perry Common in Birmingham, where they took over their own estate that was threatened with demolition, were gifted the land by the council, and have not just rebuilt that estate, but regenerated the entire area to provide choices and chances for their young people. And they've done it because somebody had the foresight to stand up and say we could do things differently, and other people in power responded. And that's the approach that we intend to take if we win the trust of the people to govern in 18 months' time.
Thanks, and you wrote quite a powerful book, All In: How We Build a Country That Works, which was kind of published last year, but provides quite a backdrop for our conversation today. And you really anchor a lot of this. You sort of set out a wider vision to meet really global challenges, let alone national challenges that are so often manifesting in communities. You really sort of describe this in the context of rising alienation and populism, and sort of the decline of traditional representative democracy. It sort of feels like it's a bit more kind of existential than just a kind of policy for you. It feels like it's something so fundamental that we get right for the modern era.
I don't think still in the political system most people realise how close liberal democracy has come to collapse in recent years. We've seen both of the major political parties and the political system itself consumed by populism, which offers sometimes an outlet for the real and genuine grievances that people have and that they feel, but offers no path to meaningful change. And I think we've got to step up now and respond to this moment with transformational change. But the argument in the book is not that local is good and national and global are useless, that Westminster doesn't matter, that global systems can simply be replaced by local action. If anything, the story of my football club, with which I open the book, tells a story about how the appalling consequences for people locally when global and national systems that are supposed to protect us fail one by one, at best utterly useless, and at worst on the side of the wrong people. And so this is an argument for complete change of how we do our politics, to tilt power back to people who have a stake in the outcome and skin in the game, who are in it for the long haul and trying to build things that last, and for national governments to really step up and stop trying to do our job, micromanaging millions of decisions that are nothing at all to do with them in communities that they've never set foot in, that deeply affect the lives of people they'll never meet, but to start doing its actual job, which is to work with like-minded governments all over the world to set up, to take action on the big challenges that deeply affect us, whether it's frequent flooding across the country as a result of inaction on climate change, or the fraud gangs that operate all over the globe that cost older people their life savings in every part of Britain, and to construct the national systems that help to create the conditions in which those that are in it for the long haul, that are trying to build and create, feel the system pulling in behind them. And just one example that I give in the book is of the system that's grown up around shared exempt accommodation. This is the exemption in the housing benefit rules that allow private landlords to claim inflated rates of housing benefit for people who need supported accommodation, people who are particularly vulnerable. This, in principle, absolutely the right approach to provide additional support to those who need it, but it's become a cash cow for people who have taken advantage of the total absence of regulation, and they've bought up large swathes of the housing stock in Birmingham and Bristol and other parts of the country, letting it out in appalling substandard conditions to some of the most vulnerable people, and letting entire communities go to rack and ruin for lack of any interest or care whatsoever from the government. Now, you could sort that out at one stroke and introduce a proper system of support and regulation. Numerous charities have put forward proposals for how that can work, and there is some cross-party consensus around it. But this is what I mean when I say that the next Labour government will tilt power back to the makers and the doers and the builders and the creators, and away from those who seek to extract and destroy and take a short-term profit over the interests of the common good.
Thank you. And Labour have set out in a number of different ways, actually, quite a powerful vision of devolution and taking power out of Westminster and putting it in the hands of communities. We've got the Gordon Brown Commission that looked at the constitutional elements of stuff. We've got the Take Back Control Act that's promised, and Keir Starmer's did quite a radical New Year's speech in that vein. So can you just talk a little bit more about your plans for devolution and how you see that they differ from the devolution agenda that we know that exists already under the current government, and how will you ensure it goes beyond kind of governance tiers and speaks directly to communities and involves them meaningfully?
Yeah, so I think the first thing to say is that the key way in which it differs is that we believe that devolution so far has largely cut the people out of the conversation. It started under this government with the Osborne reforms and the devolved deal that was reached with the leaders in Greater Manchester. And that was a deal that was reached behind closed doors with no consultation. I don't blame for a moment those leaders who were told it was the only deal on offer and took it in the hope that they could build on it. But from day one, the people were an afterthought, and we need to put them back in the driving seat of their own lives. And one of the places I've taken inspiration from, there are lots of examples in the book, and I often talk about many of the brilliant examples that I've seen in every part of this country. But one of the great examples of that I've seen is in my own town of Wigan, where the council decided in 2008 that with cuts coming, we didn't know then just how deep and harsh they would be, but that we would have to fundamentally rethink the way that we did things. And so we enlisted the help of the people and we launched the Wigan Deal. This was a contract between the council and the people. And the idea was that we would put people in the driving seat of deciding what we would protect and preserve. But in return, we would ask for people to step up and help us to protect and preserve those things that mattered so deeply to them. So the original idea was to close all of the libraries apart from the one in the town centre, and many people objected. They said rightly that in the villages and surrounding villages that it would be impossible for older people and mums and dads with young kids to be able to get into town in order to access something that is a lifeline for many families. And they were right. So we rewrote the plan, we tore up the script, and we kept all the libraries open, but they are run by volunteers in many cases or on limited hours. We've got a charity called Book Cycle who partnered with us to keep one of them open. And I went into that library the other day, and it's better used than it ever was when it was solely the preserve of the council. It's now owned by the community. They have a stake in its success, and it's thriving and bustling in the heart of one of the most deprived bits of my constituency. That was the brainchild of Donna Hall, who some of you in the room will know, who was our inspirational chief executive in Wigan and has been deeply associated with this agenda and with New Local for a very long time. But it shows the seeds of what is possible if you think differently about where power belongs and what you can do to then line up local and national resources behind people. I think if there's one lesson for me from 13 years of Labour government, it's that the Sure Starts that were conceived and funded from Whitehall don't survive a change of government for more than a matter of weeks. But the community energy companies that were set up, co-ops all over the country, co-owned and run by hundreds of local people, these are things that survived. And for me, the lesson is if you want to build change that lasts, people have to have a stake in it, and people have to be in control of their own destiny.
And I mean, I guess there's an obvious question that you're in opposition currently, so it's kind of easier to promise to give away power before you actually inhabit the halls of power and the levers of power. So how would you kind of guard against that if there was a future Labour government? How would you kind of ensure, if you were to win power nationally, you'd retain that mission to give it away?
This is a question that I've asked a lot of people, from John Prescott to Michael Heseltine, people who over the years have tried to devolve more power in one of the most centralised countries in the world, with some success, but albeit ultimately, eventually, largely leaving the central levers of power untouched. And the key lesson, I think, is twofold. First of all, oppositions promise and governments change their minds. And the reason for that is often accountability and where accountability lies. It's one of the reasons why when George Osborne proposed the Greater Manchester devolution deal in the first place, I and many others said, then these structures have to be made accountable and responsive to the people that they represent. and it has to be clear who is responsible for what so that they can be held to account. Because otherwise what you end up with is a commitment to devolution that falls apart on the first failure, where government ministers are being hauled into studios to explain why things have gone wrong in parts of the country over which they had no control, and the immediate instinct is to pull everything back to the centre. So I think that's the first thing. The second thing that really has been helped by me being able to talk to people who've tried to do this over many, many years, both locally in communities and having held the levers of power at the centre, is that you have to, that so often devolution in this country has been seen as a nice to have. It's been seen as something that's good for local communities and for regions, but not something that matters to the national agenda. Well, I think that argument just no longer holds. The only route out of our national crisis is to grow the economy, and that means we've got to bring good jobs, well-paid jobs and industry back to parts of the country that have seen relative economic decline for the last 40 years. However much you try to uncap bankers' bonuses or unleash the power of the City of London, it will never be sufficient to compensate for the lack of growth and productivity and investment that has not gone into parts of the country for far too long. And that's why when we launched our growth missions, we said that we would achieve the highest sustained growth in the G7, driven by people in every part of Britain. It's the only way that you build a cohesive society and respect the contribution that people have to make in every part of our country. It's the only way that you grow the economy, that you fund good public services. In short, it's the only way out of our national crisis. And now that there is a national recognition that changing this very centralised system in order to be able to drive decision making and growth from every part of Britain, now that there is that national recognition, it's that gives me the confidence to believe that we can succeed in this where others have failed.
I just wanted to ask you a question about Labour as a party, and it's kind of, I guess it's fair to say there are strands within the party that might be a bit more sceptical about letting go of power, but maybe would see that more localism is inherently a bad thing. It might create variation, it might create postcode lotteries, and would kind of naturally be a bit more instinctive towards a kind of big one-size-fits-all, ambitious but society-level kind of transformation. Do you think it's going to be possible to kind of reconcile those two sort of strands within the Labour Party?
I mean, I think if you look at the major challenges that we face now, whether it's the climate transition, which is essentially a revolution that will leave no family, community or country untouched over the coming decades. If you look at the crisis of loneliness that we've got, the challenges of an ageing population, it's great that people are living longer in my constituency. That means the difference between meeting your grandchildren or not. But it creates huge pressure to think about fundamental reform and transformation of our public services and the way that we deliver them. If you look at all of these major challenges, there is no challenge that we face that can be solved by a handful of men at the centre pulling levers that increasingly have no strings attached. It's going to take a nation, and that's why the argument that I've made in the book, but also the argument that Labour is making ahead of the next general election through Keir and Rachel and others, is that through the efforts of millions of ordinary people, of thousands of businesses, large and small, all over the country, and of civil society coming together in order to be in the driving seat of their own communities, this is the only way that we're going to work our way out of this current malaise and towards the country that I've believed in all of my life but never yet quite seen.
And I can't let you go without asking you about all-important money and funding. You've identified before the kind of problems with the Hunger Games style approach to bidding for different funding pots that's come through the Levelling Up funding streams. We've got a question here about, will you shift Levelling Up approach that's dividing communities and making them compete with each other? So what do you sort of say on the funding front? I know it's not going to be possible to promise lots more funding. There's going to be a constrained environment, but I guess one of the challenges for local communities is how can you ensure that stability and that security that's really a precondition to real empowerment in practice?
Yeah, I mean, it's a significant challenge. If we are trusted with power in a year or 18 months' time, we're likely to inherit the worst economic situation of any government since the Second World War. And we're absolutely clear that we won't make promises that we can't keep. It's people's money, and we're going to be careful about how we spend every single penny. There are fairer choices that can be made. Some of the audience may have seen us calling endlessly for a windfall tax on the profits of the big oil and gas companies in order to help alleviate the real cost of living crisis that's afflicting most families now across the country. And in fact, when the heads of those major companies are also calling on the government to do so, saying it threatens social cohesion if you don't, seems to us a nonsense not to make those different choices. But there's also an enormous waste of money, and you alluded to it there in the idea that you can somehow level up the country by pitting areas against one another. James Grundy is the MP for Lee. He's next door to me. He happens to be a Conservative, and I happen to be Labour. But neither of us can abide the idea that somehow somebody in Whitehall or Westminster seems to believe that you can level up Wigan at the expense of Lee or vice versa. It just doesn't work. You've got to create those positive, reinforcing cycles of economic growth. And so we're going to end the Hunger Games style beauty parade, the contest that sees people, as Andy Street, the Mayor of the West Midlands, put it, going with their begging bowl to Whitehall. And instead, what we're asking communities to do is to develop their own local growth plans about how they're going to create good, thriving places with choices and chances for their young people so they don't have to get out to get on. And we're going to line up the resources that exist in national government behind them. Currently, councils have to bid into 147 different funding pots in order to deliver the change that they need. And often those funding pots come with conditions attached to them, which mean it is impossible. We're going to line up the resources that currently exist behind those locally driven strategies in order to spend that money well. And the last thing that I would say is that you might have heard Keir Starmer talking a lot about ending sticking plaster politics. I can tell you nothing drives him as crazy as short-term tinkering with systems when what we know that we need is fundamental reform in order to change the system. And one of those areas where we set out some plans recently is in my area around housing and land. Huge amounts of money are extracted from the system through land value. If you buy a piece of land with planning permission, it's worth often 10, 20 times more than if you buy a piece of land without planning permission. And what that does is create incentives for developers to sit on that land, sometimes for long periods of time until it's in their interest to release it, which is preventing us from getting on and building the homes and the infrastructure that we need in order to provide those choices and chances for young people in every part of the country. So fundamental reform of those systems so that we're back in the driving seat of what gets built and where, so that money isn't being extracted from the system, but the system is working in the interests of the common good and to support the common good. That's what we're proposing. And so while I think the situation is undeniably tough out there, and many of the organisations in your audience will be only too acutely aware, being at the sharp end of that at a time when there's little funding for their own efforts to continue. While that is undeniably true and is the case, I think there's a reason why hope burns brighter than before in every part of this country, and it's because people know that at a time when so much is broken, when everything feels pretty hopeless, that's the moment when fundamental transformational change is possible, and that's what we intend to achieve.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Well, listen, really appreciate your time. I know that it's not humanly possible to be in two places at once, although maybe one day. I'm gonna ask everyone to give you a big round of applause, but thank you so much. Thank you so much.